At the end of World War II, things were a mess. Japan was utterly and totally destroyed. We think about the nuclear attacks on Japan, but we don't talk about the 40,000 tons of napalm that we dumped on residential areas and made tens of millions of people homeless all across that country during the war. At the end of the war, it was pretty bad. Starvation was the number one cause of death in Japan at the end, and General Douglas MacArthur was in charge of trying to rebuild Japan. We moved them from the Axis, right, from an enemy to an ally, and we began to help them. We did the same in Germany, and we built two of the biggest economies in the world that came from that. But here's an interesting thing. A little side note in history that probably shocks most Americans, particularly those that own businesses or understand how business works in the United States. When Douglas MacArthur took over Japan to rebuild it, in 1948, he looked around at the Japanese landscape of business because they needed jobs. They needed to rebuild the economy. He looked around and he noticed that Japanese companies had been built on a concept called Zaibatsu. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, so my apologies to native Japanese speakers, but it believed that business should be built on these concepts, these core principles: shareholder value, centralized control, and expansion via competitive growth and acquisition. And when Douglas MacArthur looked at that concept, he was appalled. Why? Because in America, those ideas were foreign to American businesses in 1940. See, in 1940, we were using the Y theory of management, not the current X theory of management. By about the beginning of 1950, the Y theory of management was ridden out of town on a rail, and this command and control, obedience to authority, goals-based, incentive-based concept came into American management, primarily because the folks that were doing the work were former soldiers. And how did soldiers get managed on the battlefield? Generals, ranks, file, do as you're commanded, all of these kind of things. And that brought great success and victory to the United States. And that generation saw the obedience to command as something that they should do. And the ideas around management in the 1940s in the United States, when women were in the workplace, totally different. It was collaborative. It was about cooperation. It was about accommodation. We didn't want to fire people. The people had a strong why during the 1940s as to why they were working. They were trying to save the world from fascism. So instead, we've realized that we needed to empower them with the how. We had to show them how to do the work and work collaboratively. So MacArthur sees these principles in Japanese management, and he understands the American approach of collaboration, connection, support, optimization, stabilization, and he bans the practice of shareholder value being front and center, centralized control, and competitive growth and acquisition. He identifies 325 companies that are practicing business in that way. He demands that they be sold off for parts and that the money from that be given to the Japanese people. That's how anti-American the idea of Zaibatsu management was in 1948, 49 in Japan. And instead, he said, let's do what America did, what made America great in the first place. What took us from a nearly third world country in 1939, where we had starvation and we weren't a very strong military power, and economically we were okay, but that was just because of our size. Took a country that had just survived the Great Depression and a massive famine and drought across the entire nation that caused the caloric intake of people to be way less than it was today. The average American today weighs about 50 pounds more than folks did in 1940 here in the United States. Actually, 50 pounds more than they did in 42 after that was all over. So he sets up Keiretsu and says Japanese companies must be managed by collaboration, connection, support, stabilization. And he outlaws these principles. And unfortunately, here in the United States at the same time, those ideas, the ideas that in the 1940s made America great in the first place, they were rejected by 1950 here because all those soldiers coming back wanted to be managed by obedience to command. And those ideas took a plane to Japan and spent the next 30 years there. And the philosophies around management, the American form of management, collaboration, cooperation, all of these things, they became dominant in Japan. And the method of management in the United States, we created the method the Japanese use, we deferred back to this command and control method. And what happened? Well, when it first happened, by the way, Japan in 20 years after the war, 25 years after the war, became the second largest economy in the world. Yeah, pretty impressive stuff. And when America was at its peak in the late 1940s, where we were just dominating the world in production, we could produce 10 cars per employee in the automotive industry. And the Japanese, the rest of the world, could produce only 4. This is how dominant we were as a country in that year. And 20 years later, American productivity had gone up nothing under the exterior of management, and Japanese productivity from 4 cars per employee per year to 60. The average Japanese worker was the equivalent of 6 American workers in the automotive industry. I want you to just think about that. Think about your people in your organization if they did 6 times more work at the same cost. What would happen? And what are the cars that we're talking about? We're talking about Toyota Camrys over on this side. We're talking about some of the best cars in the world. And what was America making in the 1970s? Do I need to remind us how bad things were? There was a crisis in America of quality in the 1970s. I grew up in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, where half the people worked in the coal mines and the other half worked in the steel mills. And by 1976, there was nothing. It was gone. And that area still to this day, that Rust Belt still 50 years later is struggling with the repercussions of what happened at the end of World War II. Lee Iacocca goes to Congress and screams for tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. Talk to your senators, talk to your congressmen. It's unfair trade practices. It's cultural differences. It's cheap Asian labor. It's all of these things is what he says. By the way, the Japanese paid more than the UAW. So how is it cheap labor if it costs more than what America pays? And Lee Iacocca goes and tells his Congress people and screams his head off, tariffs, tariffs, while he's one of the heads at Ford. And then the next year he launches the response to the Toyota, the American response, to show the world what American ingenuity and know-how and quality can do. And he launched the Ford Pinto. Now, these are Johnny Carson jokes at the time. If you don't know much about the Ford Pinto, these cars would just incinerate you and your family as you drove along. You couldn't escape. It was just a death trap that burned you to death inside of it. 69 people died in the Ford Pinto. That was America's response. So this Y theory of management, this idea of collaboration and cooperation, the American way of running a business up until 1950, where did it's gone? It's nearly gone here in the United States. There's little remnants of it. Even the Japanese, unfortunately, have gotten away from it, taking them from the second biggest economy to the third and to the fourth, projected to be the 5th in a few years, 10th in about another 10 or 15 years. The decline of Japan is a result of them using the management system that we currently use to this day. Think about that. Have you ever thought about where the ideas come from? Where your beliefs about business were? Are they just inherited? Or do you actually know what works best? Statistically, can you show me what works best? Well, I just showed you what